Indian, it's about $80 billion of imports from China to India, approximately, and about $20 billion of exports from India to China. And therefore, India runs a bilateral trade deficit of about $60 billion. So this is the rough number for, say, calendar year 2019. So as you can see, the trade is on a bilateral basis very lopsided. India imports a lot of industrial goods, intermediate goods, finished goods, chemicals, electronics. All of them are slightly decreasing, but we're in the very early stages of that. And till fairly recently, we were exporting commodities to China, Supreme Court decisions with respect to Karnataka and Goa might have reduced that a bit, but it was almost like colonial terms of trade between India and China. How the stereotypical developed economy or the colonial economy, the metropole, would export finished goods and would import raw materials from the colonized economy or the emerging economy. And by the way, this trade completely exploded only in the middle of the first decade of this century. So around 2003, 4, 5, it really started exploding when the UPA came in, and a few years after the WTO had China as a member. Before that, trade wasn't that big, and definitely the deficit wasn't that huge. Now, bilateral trade deficit in terms of economics is not a very meaningful number. What matters is the overall trade deficit, in turn the overall current account deficit, which is necessarily the opposite of a capital account surplus. But economics is only one part of it. It really matters a lot when it comes to geopolitics. If you have actually a very lopsided trade relationship, in this case, India importing much more than exporting, then that gives India relative leverage when it comes to certain geopolitical tensions, as we saw recently. Now, China uniquely, for example, runs, if I'm not wrong, a trade deficit with Japan, with South Korea, where they in turn import more finished goods, and with Australia, although they import more raw materials from Australia. With ASEAN, it's about even Stevens. And one of the problems with India-China trade is not all of the trade is covered in the official numbers. A lot goes through Hong Kong, I don't know, maybe some through Macau, but a lot of it is increasingly being diverted through the ASEAN region as well. India has a free trade agreement with ASEAN. It does not have one with China. And a lot of Chinese companies are legitimately going to Vietnam, for example. And how much value add is there being done in Vietnam? Or is it basically just transshipment without the rules of origin being followed or not, as the trade agreement between India and ASEAN is required? It is very unclear, and it's probably being abused to some extent. To what is the extent is difficult to quantify on any real-time or ongoing basis. So the long story short, the India-China trade relationship is extremely lopsided. India is one of the big reasons for the rest of the world's deindustrialization on a relative basis, but especially for India. In India's deindustrialization, or should I say, percentage of manufacturing value add as fraction of GDP, the reason why it's, depending how you count, stabilizing 15%, is I would say a large part of that is because of China. Our entrepreneurs basically became importers. There were many problems on our side in terms of reforms, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But they never really had the incentive to actually go out and become manufacturers. Most of them became traders and importers. And that is only now slowly that India is trying to solve with Make in India. The question there is how much protectionism to use there versus how much to be clued into global supply chains, which are increasingly China-centric, and how that will now change after the American-Chinese new Cold War and the global pandemic. So how do you kind of be in a supply chain without being too dependent on China? That's the kind of finessing that India will have to do going forward.